Under the grey November skies of Kyiv, a quiet storm brews inside the very institutions that once symbolized Ukraine's democratic resilience. After more than 3 years of full-scale war and endless rebuilding, a new battlefront is emerging, this time not in the trenches, but in the courts. The arrest of Volodymyr Kudrytsky, the former head of Ukrenergo, the state company that manages Ukraine's power grid, has ignited a political fire that shows no sign of cooling. Once praised for keeping the lights on during the worst blackouts of the Russian onslaught, Kudrytsky now finds himself accused of embezzlement, a charge that critics say reeks of political motive. Inside a quiet parliamentary office, opposition lawmaker Inna Sovsun leans forward as she speaks, her tone measured but defiant. He had a pretty bad resignation process about a year ago, 14 months maybe. He was forced out by then Minister of Energy, now Minister of Justice, and so, as ridiculous as that sounds, Mr. German Galushchenko. They really wanted him fired. Her words cut through the political fog. What seems at first like a corruption case begins to sound more like a story of control over Ukraine's energy system and perhaps over those who dare to operate it independently. Sovsun explains that this struggle began long before the current accusations. The Ministry of Energy, with German Galushchenko as minister, was basically taking over control of the whole energy system. They controlled Energoatom, the big nuclear company. They were controlling the independent regulator. Ukrenergo was really run by an independent board. They were coordinating, of course, but not under direct control, and they really didn't like that. For years, Ukraine's energy grid has been a symbol of both national survival and internal fragility. Engineers worked by flashlight during blackouts, often under missile threat, patching the grid together to keep the country running. Now that same grid has become a fault line of political power. I think what we are seeing now, Sovsun continues, is the continuation of that story. There is revenge for him keeping his independent status to begin with. They're also trying to pin the ongoing power cuts on him. Her accusation lands hard. It suggests that even as Ukraine battles Russian drones, it may also be fighting a quieter war within its own ministries, one between technocrats and politicians. When the news of Kudrytsky's arrest broke, it sent a shiver through Kyiv's energy sector. Former colleagues whispered that the case was prescripted, that prosecutors were pushed by higher political interests. Supporters of the government denied any interference. Yet, as hearings unfolded behind closed doors, questions multiplied. Sovsun admits she hoped the allegations would reveal substance, not politics. I was happy that Volodymyr does not seem guilty of the accusations, she says, but I'm extremely disappointed because the system is obviously biased. I really hope there was something more to the case than just political persecution, but upon hearing their arguments, all I can see is they're just trying to find a way to accuse him of anything. Her disappointment reflects a broader frustration among Ukraine's reformists who fear the country's judicial system, long criticized for corruption, is slipping backward. Since independence, judicial reform has been a cornerstone of every government pledge, a prerequisite for European integration. But for many observers, progress remains patchy, especially in politically charged cases. The question, Sovsun warns, is whether the political leadership chooses to use those imperfections in the court system to their benefit. And unfortunately, we are seeing cases like that. Sometimes they just open a case so that a person will keep quiet for a while. No big steps, just a reminder that there's a file on you. Such tactics, quiet, subtle, chilling, echo methods Ukraine once condemned in its Soviet past. And yet, in wartime, politics has grown even more delicate. Zelensky's administration insists it is fighting corruption, not targeting opponents. Critics, however, claim the line between justice and intimidation is fading fast. When asked about Kudrytsky's arrest, President Volodymyr Zelensky offered a short reply. It's not my case. It's about the judicial system of Ukraine. I don't have any kind of attitude to this person. He was the chief of a big system, and that system had to secure our energy. He had to do it, and that's it. His tone, firm yet detached, did little to calm speculation. Supporters saw it as proof that the president respects judicial independence. Opponents saw a leader turning a blind eye to political manipulation. Kyiv's journalists note that the government's silence is becoming familiar. In recent months, investigations into state companies have multiplied, some justified, others seemingly selective. Political opponents argue that anti-corruption rhetoric is being weaponized to remove inconvenient figures. For the Ukrainian public, weary from war and economic hardship, the stakes are enormous. Trust in the judiciary, once considered the weakest institution, was beginning to recover thanks to Western-backed reforms. Now that trust risks erosion once again. Analysts in Brussels and Washington are watching closely. Ukraine's bid for European Union membership hinges on the credibility of its justice system. Each high-profile arrest is scrutinized not only for legality but for politics. A reminder that rule of law benchmarks matter as much as military victories inside Kyiv's courts. The faces of judges and prosecutors have changed, but the shadows of old practices linger. The war has made accountability both more urgent and more complicated. With martial law still in effect, the boundaries between national security and political oversight often blur. Beyond the legal drama lies the human cost. Ukrenergo employees describe a climate of fear, internal audits, interrogations, whispers of loyalty checks. Some say they no longer know whether they serve the state or a faction within it. For them, Kudrytsky's arrest is not just about one man, but about what happens when independence becomes defiance. Meanwhile, energy infrastructure continues to suffer relentless attacks. Power plants and substations have been targeted again and again by Russian missiles and drones. In this context, the idea of scapegoating an energy executive feels, to many Ukrainians, dangerously misplaced. Sovsun's criticism is not without risk. Opposition voices in wartime Ukraine tread a fine line between patriotism and dissent, yet she insists that loyalty to democracy must include the courage to question those in power. Her tone is not that of an enemy, but of a citizen demanding accountability from within observers. Recall that Volodymyr Zelensky rose to power in 2019 on promises to cleanse Ukraine's politics of corruption and oligarchic influence. His campaign slogan, "A servant of the people," symbolized transparency and justice. 5 years later, the battlefield has transformed him into a wartime president, commanding immense authority. But authority without restraint, critics argue, can easily shade into dominance. The story of Kudrytsky and Ukrenergo, then, is not merely about alleged embezzlement. It is about power, who wields it, who resists it, and who pays the price. In every democracy, the independence of judges and prosecutors defines the strength of the state. In Ukraine, that independence is being tested in real time. Across Kyiv, civil society groups have begun to speak up again, despite the war. Lawyers, academics, and journalists are calling for international monitoring of sensitive trials. They warn that even well-intentioned reforms can become instruments of control if transparency fades. The West faces its own dilemma. Western donors have poured billions into Ukraine's reconstruction and governance projects, demanding reform as a condition. But with Russia's invasion still raging, few in the international community want to confront Kyiv publicly. Instead, the criticism comes quietly in reports, briefings, and whispered concerns about judicial capture. As night falls over the capital, the lights flicker across the skyline, a reminder of both the fragility of Ukraine's grid and the uncertainty of its politics. Each blackout feels symbolic. Power restored, power taken away. Inna Sovsun, reflecting on the broader picture, says she fears what could come next. If prosecutors and ministers learn that opening a case can silence a critic, she warns, the precedent will spread, political rivalry will disguise itself as legal procedure, and democracy will erode one file at a time. Her words echo through the marble corridors of Parliament. Sometimes they just open a case so you keep quiet. A line simple in form, devastating in implication. Yet the debate is not only about accusation or defense. It's about the kind of country Ukraine wants to be when the war ends, one where institutions are feared or one where they are trusted. President Zelensky, for his part, insists that no one is above the law and that Ukraine must root out corruption even in wartime. His allies argue that only a clean judiciary can unlock foreign aid and rebuild public confidence. But critics respond that anti-corruption efforts cannot be credible if they appear selective or politically motivated. The truth likely lies somewhere between idealism and pragmatism. In a nation fighting for survival, the temptation to consolidate power is immense. The challenge lies in doing so without compromising the very values that distinguish Ukraine from its aggressor. Kudrytsky's fate remains uncertain. His supporters demand transparency. The courts proceed slowly. For now, the case stands as a mirror reflecting Ukraine's struggle to balance justice, politics and war across Europe, policymakers warn that the world's sympathy for Ukraine depends not only on battlefield success, but also on moral credibility. Rule of law has become Kyiv's second front, less visible than Bakhmut or Kherson, but equally decisive for the nation's future. In the end, the story of one detained energy executive has become a national parable about power and accountability, about reform and revenge, and about how quickly the ideals of a revolution can be tested under pressure. For now, the questions linger. Who benefits from this arrest? Who fears an independent court? And can Ukraine's democracy withstand both the bombs from abroad and the ambitions from within? As dawn breaks once more over Kyiv, the streets hum with the sound of generators and distant artillery. The resilience of a nation remains unquestioned, but its institutions, the pillars of justice and transparency, are being watched as closely as its battle lines. Ukraine's fight for freedom is not only against an invading army, it is also a fight to ensure that power, once granted, remains accountable, that judges serve the law, not the leadership, and that the promise of democracy, the promise that carried this nation through revolution, invasion, and sacrifice, endures unbroken, because for Ukraine, the verdict on its justice system may ultimately decide the verdict of history.